What do you want the sum total of your life to be? Like, one day, I know that I'm going to be in the presence of the Lord, and I'm going to be experiencing what we just sang, with the Revelation song, which is one of my favorite all-time worship songs, by the way. And I'm going to have to give an account for my life. And, what's the Lord going to say? Like, yeah, you made a lot of money, good going. You live in a nice house. You had a great career. You had lots of promotions at your job. You sure enjoyed yourself while you were down there. And I think, again, all of those things are, there's nothing wrong with them. They're good things. But I don't know that that's necessarily what I want to hear the Lord say. And I don't know that that's necessarily what I want to be the sum total of my life. I would really like to hear from the Lord, well done. And that, you really invested in what was important. And you really stood for the things that mattered. And you stood for righteousness. And you really, you had an impact on my kingdom. You made a significant difference in the lives of others. You changed the population of heaven and hell. And I think on that day, we're going to just look at reality differently. We're going to look at life differently and what is important differently. And it's the same, for our church. I think it's important for us as a people to have a passion for God's kingdom. And I want our church to really be in the business of changing lives, not in necessarily providing a nice, enjoyable time for people to come and lots of great relationships. And again, all of that stuff is really good, but, did we decrease the lostness in this community? Did we make a difference to somebody? Did we move people from a destiny of hell to a destiny of heaven? Are we able to get in there and mix it up with people who are maybe atheist or agnostic, people who don't know God? And are we able to live the kind of lives and relate to them in such a way where God uses us to advance the kingdom in their lives? And I think a lot of churches, we talk around that. We're like, oh yeah, we're going to, have these events on campus, and we're going to have, seeker services, and we're going to be really relevant, and we're going to do all these things. But, to be honest with you, most of the time we're just doing that with other Christians. And it's like all those people out there in society, that live in your neighborhood and that you go to work with, that never darken the doors of a church, nor have any interest in darkening the doors of a church. Like, what about them? Isn't that what we're supposed to be about? Isn't that the impact that we're supposed to have? But we do all this other stuff at church because it's what we know how to do. Like, we know how to, a lot of churches, how to have a revival. We know how to do a contemporary worship service. We know how to have various programs and different things here on campus that are intended to reach people and introduce people to the Lord. And sometimes we do, and that works with some people. But the vast majority of people out there, I don't really know necessarily how interested they are. And so then the conversation becomes, well, what do we do? I want to have impact in the lives of people. I really want to be that witness for the Lord. About 4 years ago, I joined a bowling league in part Not that I don't get all caught up in the sport of it, because that's just my nature, but in part, to have a platform to share my faith and engage people in spiritual conversations. And during that time, I've probably invited somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 guys to come to church. And one guy came one time at a Christmas Eve service. That's it. And it really bothers me and it really stings, but you know, I try to talk to people about the Lord and they just don't want to go there. They start backpedaling and stammering as fast as they possibly can. And maybe that's not the place for it, because, you know, we can talk about the weather, we can talk about the Falcons, even a little bit. We can chit-chat about small things, but, you know, they're really not all that interested in spiritual conversation, certainly not in that particular context. And I talk to people in our church who say they've had similar experiences and how difficult it is to engage people today in spiritual conversation. As soon as they bring up the Lord, one person said specifically, you know, the walls go up and they become very cold and disinterested and unengaged. And the look on their face is like, oh no, this guy's religious. And he wants to have a religious conversation with me. How did I find myself in this situation? And how quickly can I extricate myself from this conversation? And so, like, how do we have spiritual conversations with detached and spiritually disinterested and unengaged people? How do we have spiritual conversations with people who have a very different worldview, very different belief system from us, and so they're really not interested in having those conversations because there's no sense of a need for that sort of thing in their lives. They're not curious about it in the slightest. How do we engage people in spiritual conversation who just plain don't want to hear it? This is a very different conversation than we were having 20, 30 years ago, when it seemed like most people had a church background and were at least interested a little bit in spiritual things. And culturally, it was a good place to go. Like, hey, you know, this is what's right. Loving the Lord is right. Going to church is a good thing. And everybody kind of accepted that. And so, you know, we could have those conversations. But what do we do when people don't even want to engage? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 talks about this and gives us insight into how we can approach this type of relationship and how we can have impact beyond the walls of our church as we're out in the world and actually trying to engage people and trying to make a difference for the kingdom. The passage reads like this: live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Now, three quick words, or 3 quick points before we break down the passage. Just interesting things I think that gives color and depth to the passage. The first thing is the word good that's used in good lives and good deeds is a word that can also be translated beautiful, and is often translated beautiful depending upon the context. And the preeminent Greek scholar, A.T. Robertson, actually translates this passage as beautiful lives and beautiful deeds. I just think that's like the coolest thing in the world, that they see your beautiful deeds. Beautiful deeds are deeds that are attractive and compelling. Secondly, in using the word pagans here, Peter is referring to like legitimate non-believers. people whose worldview and belief system and value structure are very different from ours, to the point where they look at Christians and what Christians do and how Christians behave and perceive that as wrongdoing, which we're beginning to see in our society now. There are people out there now who see Christians and our views on things and our beliefs and how we act, and they say, you Christians are immoral, you Christians are wrong. And it's certainly not everyone, but there is a significant portion of our society who feels that way, and that portion of our society is growing. The final point before we break down the passage and get into the application for us and the question of the day is, in saying that these pagans will glorify God on the day that he visits us, implies in at least two ways these pagans have become believers. First, in many traditions, the chief end of mankind is to glorify God. That is why we were created. That is our purpose. And in making that statement and phrasing it the way that Peter did, it is in a sense that the pagans have succumbed to God's purpose for their lives, which we also know is being in right relationship with him. Furthermore, it refers to being ready to the second coming. And we know that we are ready for the second coming, the return of Jesus on the day that he visits us, when we are in right relationship with him. And so we kind of get a picture of the passage now from these things. And so let's get back to the question of the day and break down the passage. There are two important messages for kingdom citizens in this passage. The first one is that as kingdom citizens, we are to have an outward focus on the world. That Peter is challenging his readers to be intentional in how they relate to people in the community. That he is challenging them to be intentional, to be strategic in how they engage people, and to be strategic in engaging those who have a very different worldview and very different belief system than we do. Even those people who resist us and maybe even slander us because we are Christians. Now, this is very consistent with things that we read all throughout the New Testament, in how we are to behave and the focus that we are to have as an outward focus. You know, as ambassadors for Christ, or going to all the world and make disciples. I think one of the passages that ties in really nice with 1 Peter 2:12 is Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. Starting in verse 13, we read, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." And so as salt, we live in a way as to make people thirsty for God, and as light, we live in a way as to draw people to God. And then he ties both metaphors together by saying, live in such a way that your good deeds cause others to praise and worship God, which again is an allusion to people becoming worshipers of God or people becoming believers. Another way of pointing out this idea of having an outward focus on the world kind of comes back to a conversation, a running conversation we've been having in our church, where we've talked about the church scattered. And that's kind of, honestly, it's kind of an awkward terminology that I kind of pulled out of Scripture, and I'll show you that in a minute. But all the church scattered is are we being the church and how we exist as the church when we're not here? You know, like the church gathered is when everybody's here and we're having a worship service, and we're having Bible study, and we're fellowshipping and slapping high fives and all of those things when we're together. But most of the time, we're not together. Most of the time, we are out in the world. And when we're out in the world, we do not cease to be the church. We are the church when we're out there, when we are scattered. And so much of Scripture and so much of what it is to be the people of God is how we function when we're scattered. You know, as far as fulfilling our purpose for who we are and building God's kingdom best happens when we are scattered. Couple of biblical illustrations. I'll give you one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, we see that this is the purpose of Israel, was to be God's people scattered throughout the nations. And so when Israel was founded and God was giving the covenant to Abraham, who is the father of Israel, he tells him during the covenant, he says, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. And there are many other passages like this about Israel existing to bless the nations and to glorify God. And what happened is Israel failed in this. Israel failed to glorify God because Israel became self-righteous and inward focused. And they were not blessing the nations. And they were not necessarily glorifying God because they thought they were better than everyone else. And they just really relished their identity as the people of God. And so they just kind of kept to themselves and really did not go shine the light of God and his glory out to the nations. And so God scattered them among the nations. This is what the exile is about. And we just finished going through a number of messages from the book of Daniel and a series in Daniel. And the whole backdrop of the book of Daniel is this very dynamic. Israel was inward focused. They had failed God. They had let God down in what he was asking them to do. And so he scattered them among the nations so they would have no choice in the matter. For example, Daniel chapter 9, verse 7 reads, Lord, you are righteous, but this day we are covered with shame. The men of Judah and people of Jerusalem and all Israel, both near and far, in all the countries where you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you. And so this isn't a New Testament idea. Like some people say, well, the New Testament says Israel did all these bad things and so God moved on. No, this is in the Old Testament. This was their understanding. God scattered them because of their unfaithfulness in glorifying him and using them to bless the nations. New Testament illustration. When Jesus formed his church, he gave them the Great Commission. Basically to go out and be scattered amongst the nations, making disciples of all people. Well, after Jesus left, the disciples and everybody else just stayed in Jerusalem. No one went anywhere. Nobody scattered anywhere. And so God used the stoning of Stephen and the persecution that broke out to scatter the people throughout the region in order to share the gospel. This is known as the diaspora. And in Acts 1:8, we read, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Up until then, there's like no mission movement. After Acts chapter 8, after the diaspora, now there's a mission movement. And granted, both of these illustrations are in the context of missions, but they certainly work to illustrate the idea that we are to be a scattered people. They bolster the idea that we have a reason, that God desires to use us out in the community. He desires to use us out in society and out where there are people that don't know him in order to be a blessing to others and to glorify God among them, that he might build his kingdom. I think they also certainly illustrate 1 Peter chapter 12, verse 2. And I think this posture of the idea of the church scattered is more needed now than at any time in recent memory in our society. A couple of months ago, maybe even 3 or 4 months ago now, kind of lose track of time, I presented a white paper to our church called Ministry in the New Reality, which is kind of a theological, sociological justification for being the church scattered, just what I'm talking to you guys about now. And the idea that, yes, being the church gathered and coming together to worship and do discipleship and fellowship and all that's awesome. It's incredible. We need to keep doing it. We need to do it well. We need to do it better. But at least we're already working in this direction. And what we really need to be doing is start focusing on the church scattered. And I gave a lot of statistics, a lot of charts, like 30 pages of charts and stuff. And what I want to do is kind of revisit that. I'll just give you one chart that I think that kind of sums up all of it. And it's the chart that's here on the board. And for whatever reason, when it translated, you can't read the stuff in here. So allow me to just kind of break this down and share with you what's going on in our society and the need to be the church scattered. Why we just can't huddle up here in the church and that to be enough in order to impact our community for the kingdom or to have impact as individual believers. What you have here are 4 different generations. You have the builder generation here on the far left. All these charts, these bar graph represents the builder generation. Then you have the boomer generation, baby boomers. Then you have the Gen X generation. And then you have the millennial generation. And so there's a succession of generations as we move from left to right. Each of the blue charts, bar graphs, represent the total number of people in that generation in America. And so we see that the builders are the smallest generation right now. Then the builders are now starting to pass away. And then we have the baby boom generation, which is like twice as big. And then Gen X is not as big as the baby boom generation, but the millennials, they're basically about the same size as the boomers. The yellow bar represents the number of professed believers within each generation. These are not people who say, I believe in God, but people who have some understanding of the gospel and have made a commitment to Christ. And so we see that the percentage of builders compared to the larger population that are Christians is pretty great. There's a lot of Christians percentage-wise in that generation. We go to the baby boomers and we see that the percentage is far less in the builders, but aggregately there's actually more boomer Christians than there are builder Christians, but on a percentage basis, it's a lot less than the builders. Then we get to the Xers and we see that gap widening even more. And then we get to the millennials, where a very small percentage of millennials actually understand the gospel and have received the gospel. And then we get to the white chart, and those are the percentage of that generation that attends church on a given Sunday. So the number of people who are in church. And so you see the builders, as you would expect, there's a good number of builders are in church. More builders are in church on a given Sunday than any other generation. So more people are in church that are age 70 and older than any other generation. The boomers are close behind simply because of sheer numbers. But there's a lot of boomers in church, and a large percentage of those who attend church are boomers. And Xers even less so, and then you go down to millennials, and it's a very, very small percentage of millennials that are out in society are in church today on Sunday. 2 things that I hope you see here that are important for us to understand if we're going to be effective as God's people in building God's kingdom. First of all, each successive generation is far less Christian than the last in America. Second, even amongst Christians, each successive generation is far less involved in church and far less engaged in church. Now, absolutely, there are still lots and lots of people, millions of people, in fact, who are Christians and involved in church and love the Lord, especially in this area here. But fewer and fewer people are interested in spiritual things. Fewer and fewer people are interested in having spiritual conversations and in invitations to come to church and in activities in church, culminating with the millennial generation where 2/3 of them consider themselves agnostic or atheist. 2/3. Which means that it is going to be difficult for us to expect to just walk up to someone, at a bookstore or wherever and just engage them in spiritual conversation, and they're going to be far less likely to attend church. What this all really does is bolster the idea here in 1 Peter 2:12, is that more now than ever, it is imperative that we learn how to be the church scattered again. It is imperative that we learn how to engage people in our community on a spiritual level. Because they're not coming to us. Our sales pitches that we used to do in the past aren't working. You know what we used to do? We used to talk about evangelism, and we'd give people like a flow chart, and we'd give them a sales pitch, and then everybody you saw, you'd try and get them to go through the thing with them. And more now than ever, we have to learn to go deeper than that. We have to go beyond that and learn how to have ongoing, genuine spiritual conversations with people. We have to once again, learn how to engage people in ministry relationships. And I believe that's what 1 Peter 2:12 is talking about. It's talking about, leading people to Christ, leading people to glorify God who are non-believers, who don't even like Christians because they accuse us of doing wrong. They don't want anything to do with us, and he's giving us a blueprint for how to do that. Also, this is just a caveat, and I didn't even plan to go into this, but the Living Stones passage that our church is named after, that's about the church and what we're to be, this is the last verse in that passage. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, and then everything that goes after this. This is the culmination of what it means to be living stones. Or to be the kinds of people who live the kind of lives where even non-believers, even people who are hostile, look at us and say, man, there's something going on there. And through beautiful deeds and beautiful lives, we are able to lead them to the Lord, which is awesome. And so the first message for kingdom citizens that we find in 1 Peter chapter 2 is this idea that we are to have that outward focus, that we are to be intentional in engaging others out in the community. And I don't know about you, but, like when I started off the message, what do I want the sum total of my life to be? I want to have impact. I want to have kingdom impact for the things that matter, for the things that will last. And I know that it comes in investing in lives. Then the passage moves on, or it transitions into not only, look, you guys need to be intentional in engaging people in the community, but it gives us a method and a strategy for how to do this. That good lives and beautiful deeds not only imply an outward posture, but they imply intentional relationships with non-believers. Let's read it again. Live such beautiful lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your beautiful deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So how do we reach the pagans around us? Pagans, the term the text uses, the non-believers. Those who do not believe like we do and may even believe that we are the problem. We live beautiful lives with beautiful deeds that reflect our beautiful King and his kingdom and his wonderful gospel. I think this is why Hebrews 10:24 tells us, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, or love and beautiful deeds. I cannot think of a better strategy or one that is even close for engaging the detached and spiritually disinterested in our society. Nor can I think of a more biblical strategy. For nowhere in Scripture are we told to advance God's kingdom through institutional means. Nowhere in Scripture are we told to go out and engage the community through expensive buildings and professional clergy and polished programs. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things. I don't believe that there is anything wrong with those things. They're just not the tools and methods of Scripture. Our tools and our methods for advancing the kingdom are different. We go out armed with love and truth and mercy and grace and peace as we engage people in society through kindness and righteousness and hospitality and generosity and service. Let's break down this idea of good and beautiful deeds for a minute, and I'll show you what I mean by this. Let's take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. Now, this idea of good or beautiful deeds, we find all through the New Testament. Just if you have a concordance on your computer, you type in the phrase good deeds, and you will find that it pops up all over the place. Like here in 1 Peter 2 and in Matthew 5, and here in this particular passage in 1 Timothy. But this is the only passage that actually attempts to define good deeds. And so, here's a woman who is to have a reputation and to be known for good deeds. And then it goes on to give examples of what he means by that. And the first one has to do with family. And it seems kind of strange to us, like it doesn't fit with the other ones. She's been faithful to her husband, and she's been raising children, and all of this. And the idea here is one of loving responsibility and faithfulness. That she has been faithful in these things. And the biblical term for this right relationships is righteousness. And so this is a woman who in a loving way is righteous towards her family and has a reputation for righteousness. She has a witness of doing the right things in the right way. It then goes on, and the second thing that it mentions is hospitality. She accepts and welcomes others into her home. She refreshes others and cares for their needs. She is an open and giving person. The third example is washing the feet of the saints, which is other Christians. And back in that day and time, washing people's feet was a menial task reserved for the lowest of servants. And so this is a person who serves others without regard for herself or her own comfort or her reputation, even as Christ washed the feet of his disciples. The fourth example of good deeds is helping those in trouble, which is a picture of the Good Samaritan. She genuinely cares for people. She is kind and empathetic. She is responsive and generous. She is willing to interject herself into the lives of people, and not just the lives of random people, but into the lives of people who are experiencing trouble in a caring and sacrificial way. And then I love the last one, the way it phrases it, and known basically for all kinds of good deeds. And what he's saying is, and a whole bunch of other stuff just like this: righteousness, kindness, generosity, hospitality, and service. I preached a message series a couple of years ago called Connecting the Dots, where we talked about this very thing. In fact, this message here could almost be a synopsis of that particular series, kind of like the way Galatians and Romans work together. Not that I'm that intentional, I just thought of that. But I did the series on connecting the dots, which was based on the parable of the yeast and how the kingdom grows as yeast or a virus throughout society and throughout the community. And what happens is the gospel rides on the backs of beautiful lives and beautiful deeds as it spreads from one person to the next out into the society as we live out this ethic that we see here in 1 Peter 2:12 of serving others, having that outward focus, and practicing hospitality and righteousness and kindness and generosity and investing ourselves and inserting ourselves into the lives of other people in a way that builds them up and demonstrates the gospel. And I can think of no better strategy today with where our society is going. If we want to have impact, if we want to live lives that ultimately matter and the sum total of our life to be significant, I can't think of any better way to spiritually engage the detached and the disinterested. Now, I understand that some people are still open to spiritual conversations. I mean, that goes without question. Again, on the chart, you saw that there were still people who believed in God. Still people with a church background. Still people who considered themselves Christians. And they're open to spiritual conversations and invitations to church. And these could be anyone from a perfect stranger to coworkers and neighbors and friends and even family. However, it seems that more and more people today are just not interested. And most people today, those who have a different worldview, different belief system, are not interested in having, spiritually intimate conversations with someone they don't know all that well. And they don't like being pushed. And so we're finding it very difficult to just waltz into someone's life and expect them to open up and be honest and transparent about their most personal thoughts and beliefs. People with different worldviews, people with different belief systems typically take time and patience to process new ideas. The faith journey is a journey for them. They need encouragement. They need help. They need to see the gospel and the kingdom working, typically through a loving and faithful Christian or witness inserted into their lives and into their relationships. And of all the people that I know who have become Christians, who used to be atheists, who used to be agnostic, who used to be genuine non-believers, not someone from a church background who we invite and is like, yeah, I know I need to get back into church, and not that person, but the person who was what this text describes as a pagan. Every single person I know who came to Christ that way came to Christ doing exactly that. That's how I came to Christ. I used to be one of them. Andy used to be one of them. Is that how you came to Christ? Yeah. I have a friend in a former church named Ken. And Ken was a high school biology teacher. I assume that he still is. Hadn't talked with him in a while, but he's probably retired now, but was an avowed atheist. And I first met Ken at the baptism of his wife and 2 teenage daughters. And we baptized his family, and at that time we began to try to engage Ken in spiritual conversation and invite him to church, and Ken wanted no part of it. He resisted all of it. He was completely closed, and it wasn't that he, begrudged his family for their newfound faith. He just wasn't interested. But Ken was now surrounded by Christians because his family was active in our church. There were people in and out of the house all the time, from the church. And it was a small town of only about 3,000 people. So everywhere he and his wife went, they ran into people from the church. And Ken was open to coming to like social things. Like he never came to worship ever. But he would come over for dinner, or he would come to the Christmas party or whatever it happened to be. And so, he's rubbing shoulders with us there. And then when Ken's mom passed away, we went over and we prayed with him. And when his wife was in the hospital for an operation, we brought meals over. And I think another thing that had a huge impact is that he noticed this change in his wife and daughters after they became believers, and it was all for the good. And over a period of 2, 3, and even 4 years, Ken began to soften. He allowed us to host the youth group in his home, which gave me an opportunity to come early and talk with Ken. And he became much more open to friendship and spiritual conversation, and we began to have lots of spiritual conversations. And after about 4 years, Ken finally gave his life to Christ. And it was awesome because I know where he started, and I know the journey and the distance that it took for him to get from where he was to where God had finally brought him. And guys, our society now is just filled with Kens. And so how do we reach them? With righteousness, and kindness, and hospitality, and generosity, and service. We win them through time and patience and lots of prayer. And we win them by investing in their lives, by opening our lives and befriending them and engaging them whether or not they ever become a Christian or not. Because that's who we are. We are lovers of people. That's who our Lord was. He was a lover of people. And so it was so easy for him just to go out and engage people out in society because they knew that he was real. They knew that he was genuine because he lived this out in the community. And as Christians, we are little Christs. And I know that what I just described with Ken isn't necessarily how it works with some people who already believe in God and grew up in church and may feel guilty because they're just not currently walking with the Lord. It's a different process with them. But for legitimate non-believers, what this text calls pagans, people with the very different worldview, very different belief system than what we have. This is typically how it works. And our churches are filled with the former, but not so much the latter. But the world is filled with the latter. We're really good at gathering up all the Christians and all the lapsed Christians and all the backslidden Christians. But I think by and large, as a movement in America, Christians have forgotten how to engage the lost and how to go out and genuinely impact lives for the kingdom and have that kind of impact that is going to have eternal consequences and genuinely decrease the lostness that is in our community. And the method and the strategy to do that is right here in this passage, and it's beautiful. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your beautiful deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Man, I don't know where you are, and where your heart is, and what your passion is. I hope your passion is for people. I hope that you have a desire to stand before the Lord and to have him be so pleased that you made this kind of impact. And if that's who you are, and you're like, yes, all this stuff that I'm chasing, I mean, I guess it's good and it helps me have a nice life, but, what eternal consequence does it have? And if you want to start turning that around, I want to challenge you to begin praying about this. I want to challenge you to begin praying that God would open doors for you to have friendships and begin to engage people who are different than we are, that different than you are, different worldview, different belief system, that they are disinterested, and to begin giving you opportunities to invest in them and build friendships and build relationships and to love on those people as Christ loves on those people. And challenge you to begin to reorient your priorities in how you view the world and how you spend your time and what is important to you. Last week we talked about this idea of the church scattered again, which is when we're not here. And the importance of koinonia, the importance of biblical fellowship, and our own spiritual growth and support. And this is really kind of the other side of the coin. Okay, those are the spiritual church relationships, but the church scattered also works with ministry relationships. And there is this idea that when we leave the doors of the church, that we don't cease being spiritual, and all of a sudden we're secular and we just do what everybody else in the world does until we come back here again and get our fix. It's this idea that what we do here is really important. Because it's here where we are inspired. It's here where we are challenged. It's here where we are equipped to go out and then do the real ministry. The real ministry doesn't necessarily happen here. It happens out there in the highways and the byways and in the lunchroom and on the tennis court and in all those places. As we see ourselves as ambassadors for Christ, as we see ourselves as ministers of reconciliation, as we see ourselves as salt, as we see ourselves as light, as we see ourselves as those who carry the gospel with beautiful deeds and beautiful lives, as we invest in the people that God has placed before us. What an awesome identity that is. And what an incredible privilege and opportunity we have to be laborers in God's harvest field. And may we take that seriously. Just one quick plug. Normally I'd end the message right here. Tonight we're going to be having another one of our faith forums, and some of you guys have heard about those. And the topic tonight is we're going to be having a conversation about engaging in ministry relationships. And so if this is something that has struck a nerve with you and you're like, man, I get it. And that is what I want. I want to have impact. I want to be that kingdom citizen. And I want to encourage you to come tonight at 6, and we're going to begin that conversation. And I promise you that you're going to be glad that you came. I promise you that it's going to be insightful and inspiring, and it's going to fill you up and equip you and begin equipping you to go out and begin living this way.